Thank you for coming along in your lunch break to hear this. You see some other names on this slide as well, because there's sort of a team of us that are collaborating together and trying to make more sense of the fisheries work. And by and large, most of us, Jason, who's here today, is our data person. Which is good. But Carlos, Shona and myself are all accountants, and so there's a subset of the accounting discipline which are the social environmental accountants, and we're interested in how social environmental impacts arise from organisational behaviour, and then how accounting as a technology of both control and accountability can help deal with some of those impacts. And as I'll sort of say, it's a reasonably new but reasonably lively field. There's probably about 500 researchers worldwide, and we've been going for about 30 years or so, and so if you like, we're finding our feet in these kind of contexts as well. At the same time, I've also done a lot of work with policy and around sustainable development issues, and so in some ways that ruined me for life, because it meant I had to go wider and wider and wider, and so hence we're maybe end up where we're ending up at the moment. So I want to thank Henrik for inviting me, but also for some of the work that he did, because it was massively helpful. And I want to do mainly two things in this presentation. Firstly, give you a quick insight into how we think about organisations and the kind of categories of meaning that we ascribe to what we see in that space, and also a wee bit about the methods that we use as well. And then I also want to outline a proposed research project which is in the fishery space, drawing from the work that's been undertaken here and primarily here. So, the background. I think if I start with the last one, I think it's probably the key is that it's been so exciting to see what I would call an organisational turn in ecological research. I've been reading ecological research for a long time, and it always struck me is that people very sensibly focus on sort of very macro aspects of international policy and governance, and then they look at individuals and they miss out the thing in between, which is the organisations. And organisations, if you like, mediate between those two levels, and they are of themselves very powerful and large economic players, but also are quite a mystery to people who maybe don't do organisational research. And for us, we were just so excited by Henrik et al.'s paper. It was like one of the most exciting moments of my last year when I knew it was coming. I found out it was coming, and then when it came out, because for us, we've always been interested in ecological things, but we've never known which organisations matter the most for the ecological impact. And that paper for us was transformational, because it gave us a list of companies we should really, really care about. Previously, a lot of the samples that we would use were very much country orientated. People knew transnationals mattered, but they didn't know which set of transnationals mattered. But likewise, we would tend to look at large listed companies as opposed to companies that have an impact on a particular ecological outcome. And so if you like, that paper for us is absolutely a game changer, because we now have a different cohort of companies that we wouldn't have usually looked at that actually will have more impact if you look at what they do in an ecological sense. The way that we talk about this, because we like abbreviations, is that the keystone actors, the 13 keystones if you like, they are an important data set, but then also the top 100 are an important data set as well. From our perspective, the reason why we'd be interested in those two scales is that sectors by and large move and shape according to leaders within them. So there's always norm entrepreneurs, people that make innovations and change the game, and people follow them and look at them. They're quite often the large actors. So I would argue that the Keystone 13 have the potential to be norm entrepreneurs for the whole sector. If they move, everyone else moves along with them. But then likewise, that sort of largest 100, once they move, then everyone else moves, but also the supply and the consumer chain can move as well. So if you like, you've got these pieces in the middle that as they move about, they drag other people with them. So hence the interest from our perspective. And as I say, the key thing is, it gives us a more sensible data set of firms and their impact. In terms then of how do we understand organisations, I'll do the 1, 2, 3 first of all, and then talk a wee bit more about private governance. Is that we, if you like, have almost got a nesting process here, and that we're really interested in firms of themselves, because they are self-contained entities that have their own rationale and their own desires, their own pathways through various activities. We then see them sitting in a governance context, which includes country governance, but other sorts of governance as well. So we end up in quite a bit of the governance literature looking at how things become normal for organisations, how they change their minds, how they move and shape through time, and those sorts of things. And then we also would recognise that both the firms and the governance structures and the society they're put within also move and shape as well. So there's almost a scaling of theories and ideas that we work with. And it's always quite interesting when people talk about interdisciplinarity, because accounting has no discipline, because it has nothing that its own. We have begged, borrowed and stolen information from lots of other disciplines, and so we spend a lot of time taking ideas and concepts from other places and applying them within our context. So we would certainly see ourselves as a field of study which actually draws from a lot of other fields of study. The sad thing about being an accountant, though, and maybe this is the first time you've been to an accounting lecture, in which case I congratulate you, is that accountants are usually thought, and accounting is thought to be incredibly boring, in which case nobody looks at it. And certainly I will reassure you the technical accounting is boring, but its impacts aren't. Its impacts are very powerful. So whenever you hear that something can't be done because it costs too much, or something should be closed because it's not profitable, the detailed accounting rules that tell you those things are not predetermined. They're not straightforward. They've always got politics and sociology type issues sitting behind them. So I think in some ways, part of the power of an accountant is being boring, because no one ever looks at what you're doing, but you're doing quite impactful things. So that realisation came through the discipline of accounting in about the 1960s, 1970s. Before that, we'd have like a resource theory of a firm that saw the firm as purely economics. And if you like, microeconomics explains what happens inside firms. But in around the 1960s and 1970s, we had a broad sociological turn, where people said, it seems to be something else is going on here. There are activities within the organisation that you can make sense of using sociological theories, but also how firms operate in a wider context also can be explained through sociology and theories of that sort. And then as the governance literature emerged and developed, we've also been following along behind that. And what we would tend to do is split things into two, into state governance and non-state governance. And this becomes really important when you're looking at transnationals, as a lot of these fisheries firms are, because they are in some ways, that you could see them as being, free floating in a region, on a globe with lots of countries, and they sort of float between them. But all firms are subject to state governance somewhere, because everything has to put its foot down somewhere. So it has to have a head office. Wherever it's head officed, it's subject to state governance. Now, a lot of that governance is around, how many directors do you have, how do you appoint them, what kind of information you might produce, but there's no reason for that governance set not to include other things as well. At the same time, most of the things that you think of as maybe being state mandated are actually not. They're actually private governance initiatives. So, for example, the rules that set up stock exchanges are not state, they're non-state. So most of the stock exchanges own themselves, they set their own rules, and the government allows them to be the stock exchange. Likewise, accounting standards. So there's a lot of rules about how you both measure and then present your data. Those rules are put together by a group of experts, which states then say to their companies, you should follow those rules. So the International Accounting Standards is not a state-based level of authority. It's a non-state private governance level of authority. And indeed all sorts of things. So Global Reporting Initiative, it requires firms to make particular, well, if you sign up to it, gives them a guideline as to how you might make disclosures. That's again non-state. It's more of an NGO-driven one. So what you find with these non-state governance processes is they usually have an epicentre somewhere. Either it has a state epicentre in that a country wants to do something, but almost, if you like, farms it out for someone else to set the rules about it, and then says, yeah, those rules sound all right, we'll stick with that. So product labelling, for example, might fit in that one. Or they're market orientated, whether it be financial markets or other kinds of markets, or they're NGO orientated. So they come from these different places. They all have different flavours, if you like, given the place they come from, but they also mesh together in a great almighty stamash because all of these things operate and they might compete with each other. Sometimes you can trace things through life cycles, so the Global Reporting Initiative is a good one. It was put together with a series of, the ethical investor folk from the US. If you like, it's come to maturity. Some countries would now say you need to report something and you should use GRI. So if you like, it gets state authority that way. Other initiatives, non-state governance initiatives, come through and they die a horrible death before they even get anywhere near the becoming formalised and those sorts of things. And then other things, you know, stand out for a while and then die off as well. So it's certainly, once you're a private initiative, you don't stay forever. You can come and go, and there's a lot of, you know, power and competition and markets and all of those sorts of things that would dictate why that would happen. The final one, and number 3, is the one that I certainly find hardest, and I think a lot of us find hardest, because particularly if you're working in your own sort of area, about how does this area then change and create much wider levels of change, if you like. Because if we are about reworking the world, we need to understand how the world is put together and how we might rework it. And so in, say, science and technology studies, in some of those areas, you might find, if you like, some stories of this sort. And one of the things that is quite hard for somebody in my field is that my wee bit of it, if you like, is way down at an organisational level, and science and technology studies tells me how all of this happens, and it's actually finding the threads through that is sometimes quite difficult. So again, we have a, if you like, a scale and a joining up issue that's quite difficult for us to then take part in the kind of conversations that you have, because if you like, we're really quite sort of micro down here, whereas you might be looking at big changes up here. But I think things like the keystone actors and trying to actually find those cohorts of firms that matter, if you like, give us an intervening point between the two that we might not have otherwise had. So, given all of that, oh, there's also the totally voluntary self-governance initiatives. I think the best example in this is something called the Equator Principles. I don't know if you've come across them. No? Some people, yes. Equator Principles. This was put together by it started off in the UK with the high street banks, who part of their function elsewhere in the world was to put together funding packages for big bits of infrastructure, say pipelines or big dams or those sorts of things. And what some NGOs you know, quite cleverly did is that they worked out, say you've got a pipeline and it's creating both environmental and social havoc along its length. What you do is you figure out which are the banks that are underwriting it, and they always do it in consortiums in order to manage the risk of an infrastructure project. And then you stand outside their shop frontage and say, you know, Bank of Scotland is killing people in wherever, okay? And banks don't like that, as you can imagine. And so in that respect, what the Equator Principles were the banks who fund big projects got together and said, we need to do this better. And so what they did as the providers of funders to the people that are building the pipeline is it required, you know, social audits, environmental audits, risk assessments and those sorts of things. The first round of those rules were really quite pathetic. You know, they weren't great. They did something, but they didn't do a great deal of stuff, and it was only a small subset of banks that were involved in it. I think they're on about round 3, round 4 at the moment. It now includes everyone. The rules are quite robust. There's a monitoring and enforcement mechanism, etc., etc. So over time, things also emerge that are, if you like, voluntary self-governance, but can then take on the de facto position of being required governance. So you can't now undo the Equator Principles and say, let's not worry about that anymore. Some things, once they're done, they're done. And there may be another mechanism that would achieve the same thing, but that thing, if you like, is there. So if you like, it's banked. That bit of governance is banked, and it will be somewhere in the system. It will be used somehow. The functionality of these is fascinating. By and large, all the studies look at these individually. They never look at them together. So they always look at, well, what about this one? What about that one? What about the next one? So what do we already know then? What we know, and it's almost like a contingency model, you know, the idea that there's many things that are necessary but not sufficient to create the kind of outcomes both socially and economically and environmentally that we might be interested in. So the first thing we know is that it matters what's happening inside the organisations. There is such thing as transformational leadership, so if you get the right leadership team at the right time, things can happen quite amazingly, and sometimes you don't quite know why, but then you have a look back in and you find out that somebody was in there that was able to mobilise change within the organisation. So there's something going on internally. By and large, our data about what's going on internally is incredibly episodic. So we just see little snippets from time to time. But management accountants, which are people who are more interested in what's going on inside the organisation, will do big case studies, or quite often longitudinal case studies, and track what's happening within the rationale of the organisation for change to take place. They're really interesting studies. The problem with them is that because they are all, one here and one over here and one somewhere else, they're not joined up. And so it's quite unusual for us to find a sort of like a systematic literature review that says, looking at all of these, 23 studies of individual firms, what do we now know? Partly because our literature doesn't publish it, which strikes me as quite crazy, but also because we think that each particular example is very particular, it's quite hard to add them up as well. So there's a methodological reason. The second thing that we know is that we know that doing things together works better than doing things alone. And so there's any number of studies, particularly when organisations or industries are trying to deal with something that's quite system-wide, that doing it together works better. And the Equator Principles is a very good example of that. Another example, which is probably too early in the day to think about because it involves drinking whiskey, the Scots Whisky Federation is a very interesting organisation. They have a real problem with Scotch in terms of you can only make it in Scotland. So that means a price premium, but it means that if something goes wrong in Scotland ecologically, like availability of water, you can't make it. And so they've got a water availability issue that's coming through as climate change effects come through. So what they've done is they've taken climate change responsiveness out of the individual firms, and they deal with it as an industry association. And so if you like, they've removed it from the competitive space, but also let's face it, you're not going to say, oh, this whiskey tastes nice and low carbon, doesn't it? It's not what you're drinking it for. So they were able to take it out of a competitive space, and they do it as an industry-wide effort. In the early days of environmental reporting, the Electricity Industry Association did a across-the-board report, and then companies would feed their reports into it. So the holding hands and doing things together is a really, we see a lot of it, and it's a really powerful way again to move things on. And then the final thing, and this is where Bert Scholten's really becomes quite important to our wee organisational team, is that who owns you matters, okay? So if you are a listed company and you've got an exposure on the stock exchange, particularly to people who are buying and selling stocks quite often, you've got virtually no financial room to manoeuvre. And so a really good chief exec of the likes of Shell or BP can do two things simultaneously. They can look for the results in the next 3 months, i.e. quarterly results, because that's where you're going to be traded or not, and then you can look 20 years out. A good CEO doesn't, not that interested in what's in between. They have people to do that, but you have to hit the next 3 months, and you have to have a plan for the next 20 years. So who owns you, if you like, pulls your time frame right back to really close in time. And there's lots of problems with stock exchanges. Mainly they're short term. They trade more often than they should from an economic perspective, partly because you have to pay to buy and sell, so you can see where those incentives run. But also that they're quite irrational. Never do anything exciting at Friday lunchtime, because Friday afternoons the stock markets are also always irrational and erratic. That's because people have been drinking at Friday lunchtime. If they really hate bad news makes them act hysterically, and then they recover a bit. So when you see something go boom, it's called the dead cat bounce, which I think is probably not very nice, but that's what it's called in finance. That always happens because they don't like bad news. And they will gradually creep up on good news, but you disappoint a stock market participant and they go quite fretty about it. So stock markets are not, they might be efficient overall, perhaps at a stretch, but they're not very efficient. If you are then owned by a subsection of a stock market, which is the socially responsible investors, if you've got a good number of them in your stocks, you've got some basis on which things might trade less, become more engaged and slower. So you get a different kind of shareholder that's not buying and selling you as a source of cash, but is interested in you as an organisation. So they're quite good investors to have. Across the whole of the average across the world, in terms of socially responsible investors of all sorts, and that's quite a contested term in itself, is about 10%. So they're not big in absolute terms, but their impact is big. because people say, well, if a socially responsible investment sort of group, if you like, dumps somebody because they don't think they are anymore, other investors will also leave because they see a socially responsible investor tick, if you like, as also an indicator of quality. And so if you like, there's a halo effect around being on the socially responsible side of things. There are also stock market indices that say here are the best in class. If you join or leave that indice, you have a different trading pattern. And so people do also care about being in the, the FTSE for good cohort and those sorts of things. They don't care enough, I would argue, but they do care a bit anyway. So there is an effect from that. The other thing, though, is that actually, when it boils down to it, a relatively small number of companies are listed on stock exchanges and traded. It's really hard to know what the figures are because they vary by country, but they're put together in different ways. But my best guess for the UK, for example, is about 40% of our GDP is tied up in the public sector, because we put health and education in the public sector, which are always big players and really change, depending where you put them, will change your percentage. Of the rest of us 60%, easily 20 or 30% would be third sector organisations, so charities, etc., in there. Of the rest of them, probably only about 15% of the total GDP is listed stock market companies. The rest of it is small and medium-sized enterprises. And across Europe, SMEs really, really matter in terms of economics, in terms of job creation, in terms of what they do. We don't know a lot about them because they're all too small and there's no ready database of what their figures are. So there's been an under-researching of these kind of organisations that are not listed but are quite active. What research there has been shows that they over-invest in ecological security. They also over-invest in employee work, in benefits and those sorts of things. The literature says they over-invest. I say that's good. It's maybe appropriately invest, but it's more than would be economically rational to do. And so in that respect, we know that in that sector we have some really interesting things going on, but we know virtually nothing about it as a field, because it's something that's quite hard to get the data. It's easy to get the stock market data, and there's a big industry twirling those tapes and seeing what you get, which from my perspective I find actually quite boring, but there's a lot of people working in that area because you can make publications quite easily. In terms of what's unexplored in that area is that what we have never done is I've never seen a study that looks at more than one intersection of these different things. So if you said, do I have socially responsible investors, you can do a percentage on that. You can do, well, who signed up to the Global Reporting Initiative? I've never seen a study that puts those two things alongside each other and says what you find as a result. Jason's done some pilot work looking at the data for the intersection of the two. It looks like there's a really different cohort at that intersection. So some of the work that we want to do is actually looking at intersecting normativities. So if you sign up to the Global Compact, and if you sign up to fair trade labelling, and if you sign up to Marine Stewardship Council, and if you then have and you do a GRI report and a lot of your investors are socially responsible investors, it is likely you're doing quite different things. And so it's actually finding, if you like, those places where all those elements come together would be quite an interesting set of investigations that no one that I know of has ever had a go at doing. In terms of the other side, what do we know? We know reporting really matters. So quite often you sort of say, well, somebody produces some data, they don't audit it, nobody reads it, so what effect might it have? So there's a level of cynicism about reporting, which I think is probably appropriate. But what we do know is that the production of information induces behaviour change. And so there was a requirement in the pensions legislation in the UK maybe 10 or 12 years ago, where you had to say whether or not that you had an ethical screen as a pension fund on what you invested in, and if you did have a screen, what was the nature of it? And so you could say, well, I don't have a screen, I don't want to have a screen, but I have to say I don't have a screen. And what it resulted is lots of people saying, I don't have a screen. Is that good or bad? Can you find out what a screen is? And could we have one? Maybe, in case. And so what happened is that, if you like, the requirement to say something resulted in all this behaviour change. I mean, this is the basis for Weight Watchers, Alcoholics Anonymous, all of these sorts of things. It shouldn't surprise us. So actually requiring information, even if it's negative information saying, I don't have something of that sort, induces change of various sorts. So disclosure does matter in all sorts of ways. Disclosure also matters mainly because a lot of it's about signalling reputation. So the ability to produce a GRI sort of basis report matters more than what's in the report. So the ability to signal that you've got things under control, that you've thought of your issues is quite important. And then there's this sort of idea that this information is used by decision makers. In all of the studies I've seen, we've not managed to find any evidence for that, but we thought we wouldn't tell the companies we're trying to get to report that information, okay? So it's probably not useful, decision relevant, but it might be, if you like, if it wasn't there, people would worry about it. So particularly if you're a mainstream investor and you're buying or selling things, you may not use the information in an environmental report distinctly, but the fact that someone could produce one you might use. So in that respect, it's very hard to see who is actually using the information and for what. The whole reporting to impact relationship is mixed and quite difficult to get a hold of. So there's a huge number of studies trying to find the magic link between here is my information about being responsible and here is my enhanced share price. There isn't a systematic link because it's too, at the moment all the proxies are too noisy, and it does depend. It depends on where you are and what you're doing. There is some work looking at what prompts reporting or increased reporting. Usually a fine the year before does that. So there's a sense in which if you get caught out, the quality of your reporting enhances the next year. So there's some of those kind of relationships, which again shouldn't overly surprise us. The thing that we're all looking for, the golden snitch, is does reporting signal better environmental performance on the ground? That's very hard to work out because you never know what environmental performance is on the ground. People look at things like fines, prosecutions within regions and those sorts of things, and if anything there's probably a negative relationship between those two. So the more you report, the more likely you are you might have lower environmental quality going on the ground. So anyway, that's another bit of bad news that we'd like to repress and suppress from all reporters. But it may also be that because we can never really judge what environmental actions are actually happening, it may be that there is a relationship, it's just that no one has yet found it in amongst the proxies and the noise that comes from that. And then finally, which is why I want to come on to the proposed program of work, we can't tell independently what is an ecologically significant data set. We just know it's a bunch of companies. You might know it's a bunch of companies working in electricity. So in some ways you kind of know the issues around climate change and electricity, but we know nothing about them individually, and if it gets more complicated than electricity, we don't have a scientific background to know if they're good or bad or indifferent. So hence collaborations are really valuable. I shall pause here briefly if anyone has any questions about that, because I now want to say what I'd like to do. This is, if you like, what our field has had a go at doing. Go for it.
Did you just say that there was a suggestion that more environmental reporting is associated with worse performance on the ground?
Yeah, but there's only a very few studies that have tried to actually measure, well, what is your environmental performance, but those who do, and it might be that it's positive but you can't get it published if it's positive because it's not a very interesting story, but if it's negative you do get it published. But the published work seems to suggest that there is an inverse relationship. Yeah, so that's a pretty depressing statement, isn't it? Yeah.
Rather large industry, the reporting industry.
Yeah.
Just about yours, presumably, the whole kind of communication infrastructure.
Yes, but it might be, and this is where there are some sort of like economic theories that are quite interesting. It might be about signalling, it might be about reassuring, it might be about maybe everyone has poor environmental standards and you only catch out the guys that are good reporters because there's a lot of people who don't report. So there's a whole lot of sampling and methods issues in there, but it's always very dismaying when you see a result of that sort because it then disallows all the reporting. And I'm not sure what the reporting's doing, but I suspect it's one of those necessary but not sufficient activities. So I think in a whole life of an organisation, the reporting helps. It certainly helps people understand themselves better, expose their thinking to the risks, to things that they thought they were great to find out they're not great, in which case it's probably got a lot of internal work that goes on, which is quite different from its external work. Yeah. I'll go back there and then towards the middle. Yeah.
I just wonder about your field and how, because you described a lot of the studies as looking at very narrow kind of interactions
yep.
of the components. of your system. But is it, do you feel like, and it feels like you were coming more from a systems thinking and complexity thinking. Is it like, are you in a minority and you see that sort of happening?
Yeah. Yes, it is a bit more. There's lots of people who intuitively and wholeheartedly agree that we need to get more complex in order to get there. The amount of that you have to invest in knowledge to be able to know how to do that within our field is quite substantial. So I think that puts a lot of people off. I am probably the most systems person in my field, and that's partly because of some public policy work I did in the UK for 10 years where I had to go wide, and having gone wide I just couldn't bear to go narrow again. And so I belong to something called the Centre for Social Environmental Accounting Research, and we do masterclasses and training in summer schools and those sorts of things where we're trying to do exactly that work and use lots of work from, for example, from this institute saying, okay, well, let's try to get you ecologically literate and then come down to the organisations, as opposed to like all our trainings do. You start with the organisation and then you work up. If you do that, a lot of people stop before they get up. So we're trying to train particularly our PhD scholars to have see all of this. Let's go down to it from there. So yeah, it's not the norm. I wouldn't claim to be usual in that respect. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the reason could be for what you discussed, what you said just now, that it's only when you've been fined that you actually do a reporting.
Yeah.
So it's a time issue, or have they?
Yeah, and lots of people do studies with 1-2 year lags in it, but also because the things that our eyes are drawn to as accountants will be, what's the debt to asset, how much debt do you have, what's your profitability look like, and some of those sorts of things. So the kind of factors that we will look at often have time lags in them, so we're quite good at time lags. Well, the other thing is that, particularly for a finance study, you're probably never looking anything less than, say, 10 years and 300 companies. So to get really good quality publications, the data requirements are also quite extensive, which is why we end up in the same data sets all the time, because of the data requirements.
Do you have any publications summarising this? What do we already know?
No. Yes, indeed. As I was writing this, thinking, because it was quite hard to write the preceding 2 slides. I was thinking, oh yeah, perhaps I should write something about this. What we know all together. Yeah.
It's quite helpful.
Yes, yes. But also I think would be helpful for us as well, and there's a sense in which I've done a recent paper outlining what sustainability science is, how it operates and those sorts of things, and its relevance for us. And I always knew that the mirror image of that paper was try to explain ourselves to other people. So yes, it's on the list. There's lots of things on that list, as you know. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a very specific question. I think you mentioned that about 10% of investors are socially responsible, or
yep.
I don't remember the exact term you used.
Yeah.
But you also said it was contested, the term in itself. So what is that based on? How do you become a responsible investor, and how do you get to that 10%? Because it's a very small bit of
but you tend to have to self-identify. And so you identify that you do it one of 3 ways. One way is that you exclude things that are nasty. So you maybe don't invest in arms, pornography, alcohol, those sorts of things. And indeed the Scandinavian countries were, if you like, the innovators in that. Then you get the positive funds that say, well, I'll invest, but only in things I know are good. So they're in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, can have its own issues, but renewable technologies, etc., public transport systems and whatnot. Then the third lot, which I think are the most interesting, which are most difficult, which is I'm not going to be too judgmental, but whoever I invest in, I'm going to work with them so that they improve. Because if you think about who counts in an organisation, if you're listed, it's your shareholders. And and it's not illegal or anything, there's lots of interaction between the company's management and their shareholders, either one-to-one or one to a group. And so if you're a socially responsible investor and you've got some ownership, you can go in and say, look, we're concerned about the following things. We'd like to work with you to try to actually address those because we know they're difficult. So if you like, there's that group there. There's also another group which are really interesting, which come into this sample, and that's the sovereign wealth funds. So a lot of countries, and Norway would be the best example, is that they've taken their oil money and invested it widely. Now, sovereign wealth funds are very unusual in terms of They're an unusual sample. Norway is the biggest, but the Middle East has loads of them as well because of how they've chose to do it. You know, there's one in Malaysia. I mean, they're all over the place. They're unusual because they tend to hold for the longer term, because if you like, they're looking at longer term investors. And for the Norwegian one, it has an ethics board that advises it, but it also is quite transparent about how it does stuff. They're also a big holder of marine fishery stocks.
Yeah.
Okay. They also regulate marine fishery stocks. Okay, so in that respect, you know, sovereign wealth funds, if you like, are a different category again. And what's quite nice about them is that there's relatively few of them, so you can get to, if you like, the whole population quite straightforwardly. But they do invest differently than other investors. They invest differently. Say, if you look at the Malaysian stock market, the Malaysian sovereign wealth fund invests differently from the rest of the Malaysian investors, but it invests more similar to Norway than it is to its own country investors. So there's almost like a whole cohort of investors, which, if you like, are country-based investments, and they are very similar to each other, and they're more long-term and hence more interesting as well. Yeah. So there's lots of players. I mean, there's any number of. I can't believe how many good projects there are in the world. Only one lifetime. So what we're trying to do in partnership with, you know, several people in this room is to do three things. And this is just, if you like, we've got a grant in with the European Research Council, and I'm not even going to talk about being British at the moment because I'll just cry. Okay, so at the moment what we're trying to do is seeing if we can get some core funding to do three big things. The first one is what we're calling the enabling research, and that is to build some databases that sit alongside the keystone actors and the top 100 marine fisheries firms. And so these would be databases about the organisations in particular, about their owners, and then the third database is about what norms they're associated with. And so if you like, this is where we could get to the intersecting norms. So what we'd expect alongside that as well then is, okay, well, what stocks are they fishing? You know, what are they maybe, you know, big in? Which regions are they fishing in? What's the regional governance, etc. So basically trying to build, you know, a very, very large database that then you can start saying, well, okay, what relationships are there in here, if any? I can't imagine there's none. There's no way there'll be none. There'll be associations and things going on that we can't see without some systematic analysis and looking into it. In terms of the number of years, there are two ways to build it. You either build a 10-year database, so you've got a time series analysis, or you build 3 snapshots in time, spread them out and have a look at them over time and see what things are changing. Now it's a very, the marine fishery sample is very dynamic, and it's buying it, selling itself all the time, which you'll know better than I. And there are ways to cope with that, but actually some of that data, some of those, it is data problem if you haven't got the same item running throughout it. But they're all resolvable. In terms of the normativity database, what we think that we're going to have to do to build that is to synthesize basically four literatures. There's a literature on corporate governance that goes, well, how do you characterize different forms of corporate governance? There's one on transnational governance as to what happens across the world. There's then things on, you know, ecological governance of various sorts. So things like the regional fisheries organisations would be good examples of those. And then there's another one that's entirely fallen out of my head, which is a great mispleasure. Anyway, so what we think is that there's several literatures, and I've always dipped into the sort of the transnational literature and dipped into the ecological governance literature, but I think if we actually synthesize those together, I suspect that we're using some of the same different language for the same terms. I suspect there'll be concepts in there which are constant to all as well. So actually to make sense of that, I think would be a great help to all of those fields, because we're all talking about the same thing. We're always using slightly different words, and our theories are quite often layered at different layers. So in an organisation, or for an organisation, we would talk about institutional theory, which is, you know, quite a, you know, we use new institutional economics. But if you are looking at international law, you use regime theory. The two are basically the same thing, but just with scale issues between the two. So we'll also see if we can actually start, you know, having some theories that map on top of each other, but deal with different scales, because that'd be quite helpful to know about. There's then, at the moment, 4 elements to the research program that we're sort of proposing. The first one is accounting and reporting on biodiversity, and there's a little bit of a literature just started to burst into our field in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of things like climate change, which isn't new to anyone, is only really starting to have a lot of literature in our field on it. And there's something interesting about the sociology of our field, that it takes at least 10 years before we notice anything that's happening elsewhere in the world. So biodiversity is coming along a bit earlier than usual, but we would want to actually contribute to that field. At the moment, most of the biodiversity people are talking about is the nice charismatic stuff. So there's a whole series of work going on about, you know, pandas and rhinos, which you know, are not uninteresting, but I don't think is very useful. There's a lot of terrestrial ecosystem stuff, but no one's noticed there's fish in the sea. So in that respect, it's an area where there's been 2 or 3 papers on farm salmon, which is quite helpful given the sample as well. The other thing we want to look at is something called the Oceans Disclosure Project. Now, there are lots of disclosure projects, and they're quite interesting beasts. So if you're in a disclosure project, of which the Carbon Disclosure Project is the earliest and the best developed, then you're any kind of investor. You don't have to be a responsible investor to be in one of these projects. But what you do is you get together and you say to all the firms that you might invest in collectively, here is a pro forma of information that I need to make my decisions well, and around climate change, for example. And over time, if you like, that list of things gets longer and more sophisticated, but also other people join the disclosure projects, like regulators, other market participants, insurers, which are really important in these kind of spaces. And so what's happening is that there is the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is quite a massive presence and does a lot of work in shaping organisations thinking about it. They have then spawned off 2 other ones. There is the Water Disclosure Project, which is the next developed. Then there's the Forest Disclosure Project. So you can see where they're working through this whole set. Then there's the Ocean Disclosure Project, which is not one of theirs, but if you like, is something taking that same approach. And it's just got its first pilot companies involved with it to say, well, okay, what kind of information would we need? So our view is that the other disclosure projects that are better developed, if you like, they give you some sort of template about how you might do this and what are the pitfalls and what are the things that you definitely want to do. But also actually just seeing how the Ocean Disclosure Project develops and moves forward. It's been spearheaded by people with much more of an ecological interest, so we would hope to be able to sit alongside them and maybe provide some information from our side of things. The third project is let's have a look at who's investing. So knowing who's investing in these firms is equally, just massively exciting to even have a snapshot of that, which you have, which is a really interesting set of people. Some of which I have to tell you is really bad news they're investing in, but that's part of the deal. And that's where the Sovereign Wealth Fund work comes in as well, in terms of what we're looking at there. And then the fourth part is really is an act of hope and expectation. There's bound to be some interesting intersections, and actually looking at those in depth. So a mix of, if you like, big scale work through the enabling research, some focused programmatic work, but then also looking at some hotspots and case studies within there as well. Alongside it, we realised we need a synthesis project because partly to address some of the things that we were just talking about. So we think this is transferable in our field. If we could do a map of how do you address a significant ecological issue through the lens of organisational studies, we'd like to leave a map on how to do that, and particularly a list of things not to do, because we're bound to have a go at things that don't work, because that's the nature of the beast. The other thing is that trying to build conceptual tools for organisational studies, and we have quite a lot of downbeat articles from editors in quite powerful journals at the moment saying, we spot the global environmental challenges, we spot the sustainable development goals, we know they're out there, we don't know what to do next. So there's a job of work to do there to help us help the field to deal with it. And then obviously the synthesis project of working with stakeholders and alongside stakeholders in this process is absolutely necessary. There's then some orphan projects that didn't fit in anywhere sensibly, like all the illegal and unregulated fishing type material. We'd have things to offer in that space, and they're not in this package because it just didn't make sense for the particular application that this went forward to. But the other thing that I think is quite interesting is Port State Authority. So I've done quite a bit of work with lawyers in the past, and so the lawyers, if you like, are really interested in ports as a non-state actor that creates particular patterns of normativity. So ports are really powerful players. So there's obviously work in that area. And then there'll be loads of other things as well. But if you like, I tried to make something coherent to the funding body that we're pointing things at. In terms of what we might do then is that at the moment we're just desperately trying to find somebody to give us some money. If not, we'll do it on the cheap because we're quite cheap. That's a problem with organisational researchers, is that we can give us a database and we're happy. Of course, building the databases is another problem altogether. But there's a wee cohort of us that are absolutely excited by that keystone publication that for us goes, we can make a connection, which just makes us so happy. And occasionally I've started to present that work to my field and they go, oh wow, how come we didn't know? And the answer is, you don't read enough. Okay, so it's sort of reading widely that helps you get there. And so I'll leave you with a sculpture which is labelled the Anthropocene, because I'm also spent the last 2 or 3 years reading everything I could find on the Anthropocene, just because it's, I think it's going to be the framing, and in some ways it's a metaphor, in other ways it's quite helpful in thinking about a lot of these issues. So this is an underwater sculpture which is called the Anthropocene, which I don't quite know how VW got themselves embroiled in that, but why not? So anyway, so just more than happy to respond to any questions, but also I'm here today. We've got a meeting tomorrow, but I'm around in Stockholm on Friday as well, so if anyone wants to make a time to have a more in-depth chat about anything around, and happy to do so. But also it's not the first time I'm going to come and lurk in your lovely institute. I shall be back and forth a bit, I suspect. So thank you.